Some moments in life don't look like turning points when they happen. They can be as simple as helping a stranger load groceries into the back of a car on a windy afternoon. For Tasha Green, that moment came in the parking lot of a suburban supermarket, her worn sneakers squeaking on wet asphalt as she caught a runaway cart before it slammed into a silver sedan. The woman she helped, petite, silver-haired, with eyes that hinted at a lifetime of both grace and grit, thanked her with the kind of warmth that catches you off guard. Tasha wasn't used to lingering kindness. Most days she was just trying to keep her head above water. Ever since her dad passed, she'd been juggling part-time jobs to cover rent for the small apartment she shared with her mum and younger brother. She'd given up her college classes, promising herself she'd go back one day, but for now, life was about paying bills and keeping food in the fridge. The woman introduced herself as Lorraine Carter, and as they loaded the last paper bag into the trunk, she asked a question Tasha didn't expect. "Have you ever worked with kids?" Tasha laughed a little, almost shyly, admitting she'd babysat for neighbours growing up. Lorraine hesitated, then told her about her grandson, Noah, a sweet boy, only 5, who hadn't spoken or walked since his mother passed away the year before. Lorraine's son, Evan, was doing his best to raise him alone, but they needed help, real help. At first, Tasha's instinct was to politely decline. Caring for a child who'd been through that much, it sounded like more than she could handle. But Lorraine didn't push, just gave her a small card with a phone number and said, "Think about it. Sometimes the right door opens when you least expect it." That night, Tasha sat by the window of her apartment, the card resting on the table beside an unpaid electric bill. Outside, the streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks. Inside, her mum coughed softly from the bedroom, and her brother sat cross-legged on the floor, studying from a borrowed textbook. She thought about her father's old advice. Don't turn away from a challenge just because it scares you. By morning, she'd made her choice. She called Lorraine back, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. "If the offer's still open, I'm willing to meet your family." She didn't know then that stepping into their home would change all of them in ways none of them could have imagined. The first thing Tasha noticed when she stepped out of the rideshare was how different this street felt from her own. The houses here stood tall and confident, each with perfectly trimmed hedges and driveways wide enough for 2 cars. The late autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves, and the crunch under her shoes made her suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No kids playing on the sidewalk, no music drifting from open windows, just a stillness that almost felt like it was holding its breath. Lorraine was waiting at the door of a 2-story brick home, its porch decorated with neat pots of mums. "Come on in, dear," she said, her voice as warm as it had been the day they met. Tasha wiped her shoes on the mat and stepped inside, instantly feeling the difference. Everything was immaculate: polished wood floors, a soft cream rug in the living room, framed photographs aligned perfectly along the hallway. It was beautiful, but it carried a kind of order that made her hesitant to touch anything, like one wrong move might disturb the balance. In the living room, a tall man stood near the window, his posture straight, his hands in his pockets. Evan Carter didn't look up right away, but when he did, his gaze was sharp, assessing. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't open either, more like someone who'd learned to keep his guard up at all times. "This is my son, Evan," Lorraine said gently, almost as if she were reminding him to join the moment. He gave Tasha a polite nod, then glanced toward the hallway. "Noah's in his room," he said, his voice steady but distant. Lorraine led Tasha down the hall to a softly lit bedroom. The walls were painted a pale blue, shelves lined with books and toys, but there was no sign of play. On the rug near the window sat a small boy with light brown hair, clutching a stuffed dog so tightly his knuckles were white. His legs were folded close, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the glass. "Noah," Lorraine said softly, kneeling beside him. "This is Miss Tasha. She's here to spend some time with you." The boy didn't turn his head, didn't even blink. His grip on the toy didn't loosen. Tasha lowered herself onto the floor a few feet away, careful not to crowd him. "Hey," she said gently, "I like your dog. What's his name?" No answer, only the sound of a car passing outside. She didn't push. Instead, she sat quietly, letting him know she wasn't there to force anything. From the doorway, Evan watched, his arms crossed. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe exhaustion. Tasha didn't know yet, but she felt the weight of his unspoken thought, "Prove you belong here." When she left the house that afternoon, she wasn't sure if she'd made any difference at all. But as she walked back down that silent street, she thought about the boy's eyes, how they'd flickered, just for a moment, when she'd pulled a small, silly keychain from her bag and set it near him. He hadn't touched it, but he'd noticed. And sometimes, noticing was the first step. The next few days felt like walking into a room where someone had turned the volume all the way down. Every morning, Tasha arrived to the same quiet house, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the steady tick of a wall clock echoing in the hallway. Evan would give her a polite nod before disappearing into his home office. Lorraine would check in briefly, always with a reassuring smile, before heading out to run errands. And then it was just her and Noah. He stayed in his room most of the time, sitting by the window with that stuffed dog pressed to his chest. At first, Tasha tried the obvious things, reading aloud, offering to build a puzzle, gently asking questions. But he stayed in his world, his gaze sliding past her as if she were just part of the furniture. She didn't take it personally. She knew trust wasn't something you could demand, you had to earn it, inch by inch. One rainy afternoon, she decided to change her approach. Instead of trying to pull Noah into her activities, she brought the activities into his silence. She sat on the floor a few feet away and began sketching in a small notebook she'd brought from home. The quiet scratching of her pencil filled the room. She didn't look at him, didn't ask for his attention, just kept drawing page after page. Minutes passed, then she heard it. A small shuffle. She glanced up without turning her head. Noah had shifted ever so slightly, his eyes flicking toward the paper in her lap. Tasha kept her voice casual. "I'm drawing a dog, not as good as yours though." She turned the notebook just enough for him to see the simple outline of floppy ears and a wagging tail. For a moment, his lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. He didn't speak, but when she left the room later, the drawing was gone from her notebook. She found it the next morning on his shelf, propped up against a row of picture books. It wasn't much, but it was something. From the kitchen, Evan noticed the change too. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed her a little longer when she walked past. Tasha could feel his caution, the unspoken warning that this was his son's fragile world, and she was a guest in it. Still, she knew what she was building with Noah was real, even if it was slow. And slow was fine, because in her experience, the quietest beginnings often turned into the strongest bonds. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind of grey, chilly day that made the whole neighbourhood feel slower. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Tasha set a small box on the living room rug. Inside was a set of old hand puppets she'd found at a thrift store. A goofy-looking frog, a sleepy bear, and a bright green dinosaur with a crooked smile. She sat cross-legged on the rug and slipped the dinosaur over her hand, making it peek out from behind the box. "Good morning," she said in a deep, playful voice. "I'm here for breakfast, but I only eat peanut butter sandwiches." Noah, who had been sitting in his usual spot by the window, didn't turn right away. Tasha didn't push. She made the dinosaur trip over the edge of the box, rolling dramatically onto its side. "Ow, that's what I get for skipping my morning stretch," she said, letting the puppet flop in defeat. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The tiniest shift in Noah's shoulders, a flicker of interest. She let the dinosaur crawl across the rug toward the stuffed dog in his lap. "Hello, friend. Can I sit here?" she asked, in that same silly voice. And then it came. Soft at first, almost like the breath before a laugh, then real. A small, honest giggle. It startled her more than she expected. She kept her movements gentle, letting the moment stretch. The dinosaur leaned against the stuffed dog and sighed dramatically, which earned her a second laugh, this time with his hand half covering his mouth. What she didn't know was that Evan had been standing in the hallway watching. He'd heard that laugh too, and it stopped him in his tracks. For months, he'd lived in a house so silent that every sound felt like an echo. Hearing Noah laugh, even for a second, sent something sharp and unfamiliar through his chest. But instead of stepping in, he lingered in the shadows, unsure what to do with the feeling. Tasha kept the game going until Noah's eyes began to sparkle with a kind of quiet joy she hadn't seen before. She didn't mention it, didn't try to make a big deal. Some moments were too fragile to hold too tightly. When she packed up the puppets later, Noah didn't give them back. He kept the dinosaur tucked beside him, his fingers curled loosely around it. For Tasha, that was enough. And for Evan, watching from the hallway, it was the first crack in a wall he hadn't realised was starting to crumble. But in a house built on routines and guarded hearts, even the smallest cracks have a way of being tested. The breakthrough with the dinosaur puppet should have felt like a victory. But in a house like Evan Carter's, victories didn't come without a test. A few days later, Tasha found herself back in Noah's room on a quiet afternoon. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, and the soft hum of the heater filled the silence. She sat on the floor a few feet away from him, reading a story about a little fox who gets lost in the forest, but finds his way home with the help of new friends. Her voice was calm, steady, with just enough expression to make the words feel warm. Halfway through, Noah shifted. His legs unfolded and he inched closer. Not much, just a few small scoots across the rug, but enough for Tasha to notice. She kept reading, resisting the urge to celebrate out loud. When the fox in the story finally found his way back, she closed the book and, without thinking too much, gently reached over to hand him the dinosaur puppet. Noah hesitated, then took it. His small fingers wrapped around it like he'd been holding it for years. It was such a quiet moment, but to Tasha it felt huge, a sign that the space between them was shrinking. That's when the door opened. Evan stood there, his eyes flicking between her and Noah. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharper than the situation seemed to deserve. "Nothing," Tasha said softly. "We were just finishing a story." "I've told you before," he said, stepping into the room. "Stick to the schedule. Too much attention can overwhelm him. He has a routine for a reason." Tasha felt a spark of frustration rise, but she kept her voice even. Sometimes a little flexibility can help. He's not just following a schedule, he's trying to trust someone. Evan's jaw tightened. And trust takes stability, not surprises. He took the puppet from Noah's hands, set it on the shelf, and told his son it was time for a break. Noah's shoulders curled inward again, his gaze dropping to the floor. Tasha's chest ached at the sight. She wanted to argue, to tell Evan that he'd just undone something fragile and important. But she also knew that fighting him in front of Noah would only make things worse. So she stayed quiet, watching as Evan guided his son toward the bed. In her mind, she promised herself she wouldn't let one setback erase the progress they'd made. She'd seen that spark in Noah's eyes. She wasn't going to let it go out. The tension from that afternoon lingered in the air for days, quiet but heavy. Evan kept his distance, speaking to Tasha only when necessary. She stayed professional, but her patience was wearing thin. Every time she saw Noah retreat back into himself, curling around that stuffed dog like a shield, she couldn't help but think of how close they'd been to something better. One cold Wednesday morning, the house was wrapped in the smell of coffee and toast when a sudden thud echoed from upstairs. Tasha froze for half a second before rushing toward the sound. She found Noah on the hallway floor just outside his bedroom, one knee scraped, the dinosaur puppet lying a few feet away. His eyes were wide, not from pain, but from fear. Evan appeared almost instantly, his voice tight. "What happened?" "I think he tripped over the rug," Tasha said, crouching beside Noah. "It's just a scrape, he's okay." Evan knelt down, but his presence seemed to make Noah shrink. The boy's lower lip trembled, and he clutched the puppet with both hands. Tasha reached into her pocket for a small pack of bandages, speaking softly. "Hey, buddy. Let's clean this up, okay? Then you can tell your dinosaur how brave you were." To her surprise, Evan didn't interrupt. Instead, he sat back on his heels and watched as Tasha gently cleaned the scrape and covered it with a bandage printed with tiny stars. She kept talking to Noah the whole time, about how even superheroes get scrapes, about how bravery isn't about never falling, but about getting back up. By the time she finished, Noah was calmer. He even let out a quiet sound when she asked if he was ready to stand. She held out her hand, and to her surprise, he took it. Evan saw it too, the way his son leaned toward her instead of away. For the first time in weeks, there was no wall between them in that moment. "Thank you," Evan said quietly, almost like it slipped out before he could stop himself. Tasha glanced at him, searching his face for sarcasm, but found none. Just tired eyes, the kind that came from years of holding too much inside. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, and starts were worth holding on to. The first snow of the season came earlier than anyone expected. By late afternoon, the Carter house was wrapped in a blanket of white, the kind that made the neighbourhood feel smaller, quieter. Tasha had just finished tidying the kitchen when she noticed Noah by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at the snowflakes swirling under the streetlight. "Want to go outside for a minute?" she asked gently. He didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward her, then back to the snow. That was enough. She found his little boots in the closet, zipped him into a puffy coat, and slipped on her own jacket. Out on the porch, the cold bit at their cheeks, but the air smelled fresh and clean. Noah took a tentative step onto the snow-dusted walkway, holding his stuffed dog in one hand. The quiet was so deep that the crunch under his boots sounded almost loud. "Snow feels funny, doesn't it?" Tasha said, crouching down beside him. She scooped up a handful, pressing it into a small, lopsided ball. "This is how you start a snowman." For the first time, Noah reached toward her, his tiny gloves brushing hers as he took the snowball. He turned it over in his hands, then looked up at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but close, a hint of curiosity, where there'd only been distance before. They stayed out there only a few minutes, but when they came back inside, Evan was standing in the hallway. His gaze went straight to Noah, and for a moment the sternness in his face softened. "You went outside?" he asked his son. Noah didn't speak, but he held up the small snowball like proof. Evan's eyes shifted to Tasha, lingering just long enough for her to notice. It wasn't the cold, assessing stare she'd grown used to. This one was different, thoughtful, maybe even a little grateful, though he didn't say it out loud. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Noah had fallen asleep with his snowball tucked in a plastic cup on the nightstand, Tasha found herself thinking about that look. She wasn't sure if it meant Evan was starting to trust her, or if he was just seeing something in his son he hadn't seen in a long time. Either way, it was a step forward, and in this house, steps forward were worth everything. It was late, the kind of late where the whole house felt wrapped in a heavy hush. The snow outside glowed faintly under the streetlights, and the ticking of the kitchen clock was the only sound in the air. Tasha had stayed up to finish folding laundry, the steady rhythm of it keeping her from thinking too hard about the day. She was halfway through a stack of towels when she heard footsteps behind her. Evan stood in the doorway, hands shoved in the pockets of a grey sweater. He looked less like the guarded man she was used to, and more like someone who'd wandered into the room without a plan. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake the house. He gave a small shrug. "Not really, the snow makes it too quiet." He hesitated, then stepped into the kitchen. "I saw him today, outside with you. It's been a long time since he wanted to do anything like that." Tasha set a folded towel on the counter. "It was just a few minutes in the snow," she said. "Yeah," Evan replied, almost to himself. "But it was more than he's done in months." He leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "After Anna died, I thought if I kept things controlled, schedules, routines, rules, I could keep him safe. Keep us both from falling apart." His voice dipped lower. "But maybe all I did was build a cage we both live in." Tasha didn't rush to fill the silence. She let him stand in it because she knew what it cost him to admit something like that. Finally, she said, "I get it. When my dad passed, I tried to hold everything together for my mum and brother. I thought if I just worked harder, we'd be okay. But it's exhausting, pretending you're not hurting." Evan glanced at her then, really looked at her, as if he hadn't expected her to understand. "And how'd that work out for you?" he asked. She gave a small smile, tired but honest. "It didn't. I only started to breathe again when I stopped trying to control everything and just let people in." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The quiet felt different now, not cold but steady. Then Evan straightened, cleared his throat. "Thanks for sticking around, even when I've made it hard." "Tasha didn't say you've made it nearly impossible." She just nodded. "I'm here for Noah, and maybe for you too." He didn't reply, but the faint curve at the corner of his mouth was more than enough. It was the first real sign that his guard might not be as unshakable as he thought. Outside, the snow kept falling through the night, quiet and steady, as if preparing the world for something neither of them could see coming. The storm rolled in without warning, thick clouds swallowing the afternoon light until the house felt like evening had arrived too early. By dinner, the wind was howling against the windows and snowflakes were coming down in thick, fast sheets. Tasha was helping Noah build a small tower of blocks on the living room rug when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The sudden darkness made Noah freeze. His little hands gripped the stuffed dog tight, his breathing quick and shallow. Tasha's voice stayed calm. "It's okay, buddy. Just a power outage. Happens all the time in winter." She reached for her phone to use the flashlight, but before she could turn it on, Evan came in from the hallway with a small lantern and a blanket draped over his arm. He crouched down beside Noah, but the boy wouldn't meet his eyes. Instead, he leaned toward Tasha, pressing his shoulder against hers. Evan noticed, and for a second his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Without saying a word, he handed her the blanket, and together they wrapped it around Noah's small frame. They moved to the couch, the three of them huddled close under the faint glow of the lantern. Outside, the wind roared, rattling the branches against the siding. Inside, Tasha began telling a quiet story about a bear and a raccoon who found their way home during a snowstorm. Her voice was steady, each word like a small anchor in the dark. Halfway through, Evan joined in. His tone was low, unsure at first, but soon he was giving the raccoon a funny voice that made Noah's mouth twitch toward a smile. Tasha glanced at him, surprised, and caught the faintest spark of something she couldn't quite name. By the time the story ended, Noah was leaning against both of them, his eyes heavy. Evan reached over, tucking the blanket snugly under his chin. "He's warm," he murmured, almost as if reassuring himself. For the first time, there was no wall between them, no unspoken tug of war over how to care for Noah. Just a quiet understanding, shared in the dim light, that maybe, just maybe, they could be on the same side. The next morning, the house woke to a world buried in white. Snow covered the yard in a smooth, untouched layer, and sunlight bounced off it so brightly it filled every corner of the living room. Noah was still curled up under his blanket when Tasha came in with a mug of hot cocoa, the steam curling into the air. She set it down on the coffee table, then crouched beside him. "Come on, buddy, let's go see what the storm left us." Evan appeared from the kitchen, pulling on his coat. "I'll come too," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Tasha met his eyes for a moment, reading the quiet shift in him. Outside, the air was crisp and sharp, the kind that made every breath feel new. They walked slowly down the porch steps, Noah's boots leaving tiny prints in the snow. He clutched his stuffed dog in one hand, but for the first time, his other hand slipped into Tasha's without hesitation. Evan walked on his other side, close enough that the three of them formed a small, warm line against the cold. When they reached the middle of the yard, Tasha bent down and began to roll a ball of snow. "This," she said with a grin, "is how you make the bottom of a snowman." Noah watched for a second, then crouched to push alongside her. His cheeks flushed pink from the cold, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Evan joined in, helping lift the middle section into place. By the time they stacked the head, Noah was giggling, really giggling, as Tasha pressed 2 pebbles in for eyes. When she handed him a small carrot, he placed it right where it belonged, stepping back to admire their work. Then something happened so quietly, Tasha almost missed it. Noah turned to Evan, tugged at his coat sleeve, and whispered, "Look, Dad." It was the first clear word she'd ever heard from him. Evan froze for a second, his breath catching, before dropping to one knee and pulling his son into his arms. Tasha looked away to give them a moment, but she could still hear the muffled emotion in Evan's voice as he said, "I see him, buddy, I see him." Later, back inside, the three of them sat by the window with mugs of cocoa, watching their snowman stand proudly in the yard. Evan glanced at Tasha, and this time there was no guardedness in his eyes, just gratitude, deep, unspoken, and real. In that quiet moment, Tasha knew things had changed. Not in a dramatic, movie-ending way, but in the steady, undeniable way that families begin to form. Not perfect, not without work ahead, but together. And for all three of them, together was the one thing that mattered. Healing takes patience, trust, and the courage to let others in. Even the smallest acts of kindness can open the door to change. Thank you for staying with me until the very last moment of this story. I'm truly grateful for that. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. I'll see you again soon here on Rain Inside.